The several anti-child labor bills, acts, and organizations from the early 1900s triumphantly freed 1 million plus children from unsafe working environments and prevented the tragedy of generations of children being unable to attend any forms of education. The battle against child labor has been a long and hard one in the past, filled with protests, articles, and casualties. When cars entered mainstream production, child labor heightened. Machines were already replacing hand work, but people were still needing to supervise or operate the machines. Who would be better to populate factories than a group who had little to nothing to do in their daily lives? A group easy to manipulate. A group that would work for cheap. The perfect candidate was children. Sadly, few states had child labor laws, and when cars and other at-home industrial items began to become regular, these few laws were often overlooked and stretched to the point of breaking. People were needed to build parts and miners needed to collect resources. The need for workers was so intense that the authorities continued to allow possibly illegal work to go on. It was almost like a few extra parts for a car was worth a child's life. In addition to factory and mine jobs, there were jobs available to children such as berry pickers, newspaper delivery, chimney sweepers, glass makers, and for any children with a family who owned a farm, it was guaranteed they would help with chores and other work. When children became big enough to work, it did not usually refer to their age, but instead their physical size. When they reached the appropriate height and weight, they were expected to begin working and help provide for their families. In the early 1900s, a census showed that 1 in 5 children were employed and worked for at least 6 days of the week. Families of higher income spent all their money on their children and their futures, but families of low income were forced to throw their children into the wild to work. And working was never a child's choice. When a child was born, they were considered property of the father. They may be forced to work at a factory to help with the family's debt, or they may have to do tedious tasks at the family's own business. In many places, children earned 33% of the total income of the family, and they hardly got to keep a dime for their labor. Often, children would use acts to trick people into buying their newspapers or anything else they may be selling. They would dress in rags and beg for people to buy their last item. When they eventually tricked them into purchasing the merchandise, they would pull out yet another item and use the ploy again. Luckily, there were organizations that would attempt to help children in any ways they could. One of these organizations was called NCLC, National Child Labor Committee. They did everything from finding safe jobs with reasonable hours and offering them to children in the streets, to hiring photographers and journalists to expose dirt on the companies. NCLC was founded by Florence Kelley. She was a children's and women's rights activist. One of the most famous photographers from that time was also hired by NCLC. His name was Lewis Hine. Lewis's father died when he was young, so he was forced to help sustain the family. His first job was a furniture maker. He worked 13 hours a day, 6 days a week, and made a total of $4, around $100 today. When he was older, he became a teacher, and then quit teaching so he could work for NCLC, where he would be a photographer who exposed the horrible truths on these companies. Almost every photograph regarding child labor from the early 1900s you find today was taken by Lewis Hine. Many marches and protests against child labor occurred. Children would walk out of factories and other places of employment with large signs. In these protests, violence commonly arose between strikers and police officers. Children were thrown around, and some were seriously injured. Frequently, children would be beaten or punished for these protests. Some were even fired and thrown out into the streets. Families were forced to find new jobs for their children, and even then the same thing would commonly repeat itself. A famous protest was the 1912 Lawrence textile strike, where hundreds of thousands of mill workers, mostly women and children, walked out of their workplaces. They were striking against the reduction of pay and the fastening of the machines due to a law that turned the maximum amount of working hours from 56 to 54 hours a week. Violence grew, and police officers and soldiers began to become violent. Many of the protesters tried to send their children out of town away from the violence on trains, but the officers would stop the children from boarding and beat them. A 7-year-old was given a black eye and a broken rib. Citizens across the country heard of the violence, and the pressure of a federal law to prevent child labor grew even more. especially when many of these children testified in court. From 1902 to 1906, 69 news articles were published regarding child labor. A handful of these were sponsored by the NCLC. Many of these articles admitted that there was a huge need for child labor, and it would damage the economy severely to ban it, but they were hopeful the nation would be strong enough to survive the blow to their production rates. Florence Kelley, the founder of NCLC, wrote the first version of a child labor legislation. She gave the greatest speech on child labor ever, or so it was considered. Her bill contained a minimum working age of 14 for manufacturing and 16 for mining, and it specified a maximum workday of 8 hours, required proof of age, and banned working in the night. The biggest obstacle in preventing child labor was that the president at the time, President Roosevelt, was against a federal law and decided it would be best as a state law per individual state. Because of this, the states felt even more pressure to pass laws, but at the same time they didn't want one state to get ahead of them. By banning children, it would be setting back the state, and most of them refused to allow this. But slowly, with the pressure of Lewis Hines' photographs, the evidence of the protests, the horrifying news articles, and the pressure of the public, states slowly began to ban child labor. By 1912, every state had a law on child labor in the books, but none had adopted NCLC's original law. 8 states still permitted children under 14 to work in industrial places. But still, these laws were almost just as overlooked as the ones from before Florence Kelley's speech. The need for workers was still too high, and it was now 100% clear that a federal law was in need. President Taft signed the Children's Bureau in 1912, which was a federal organization to help prevent the overlook of these laws. 1 year later, Woodrow Wilson was elected into presidency. Sadly, he appeared to have little care for the cause of child labor, but with the public demanding a federal law, he was forced to take responsibility and join the cause. He and NCLC signed yet another law. They endorsed a new bill that banned children under the age of 14 from factories, workshops, and canneries, and children under 16 from mines and quarries, as well as prohibiting children under 16 from working more than 8 hours a day and between the hours of 7 p.m. and 7 a.m. But many states had already the same and some even more intense laws, so it was hardly a drastic change. Luckily, since it was now a federal law, they were taken much more seriously, but even then, there were industries and companies that continued to stretch to the lengths of the new federal law. In 1914, Robert L. Owen and Mitchell Palmer, 2 Democrats, brought to the table an even stricter bill. There was little opposition to the bill. The bill passed, but the Senate ruled it out soon afterward. It was never signed. The next version of the bill was introduced in 1916. It had the most stringent rules yet. It was now funded by Democrat Edward Keating as well as Edward L. Owen, who had partially brought up the Palmer-Owen bill. This time, the bill was supported by nearly everyone. People were tired of seeing children in the streets. This was known as the Keating-Owen Act. The bill passed in the House 343 to 46. The current president, Woodrow Wilson, had thought the many child labor bills were unconstitutional, but his longtime friend at NCLC, Alexander McElway, had lobbied him to support the bill. It passed through the Senate, unlike the Palmer-Owen bill, and it was signed into Congress on September 1st, 1916. The Keating-Owen bill lasted only until 1918, when it was struck down by the Supreme Court. The war for child labor continued, with trying everything from trying to tax child-hired companies more, all the way to trying to outlaw child labor was a constitutional amendment. These failed, and children continued to work until 1938 when a federal law was signed, which gave all kinds of new labor rules. Child labor was included in the bill. The war to stop child labor was a tedious one. Many bills were brought into Congress and several strikes occurred. Children lost their limbs and lives, but in the end, generations of people were saved. Children nowadays are required to get an education, and hardly any need to work. If they do, it would most likely be at their family's farm or business. The war that the NCLC, Edward L. Owen, Mitchell Palmer, Edward Keating, Alexander McElway, and hundreds of thousands more led to save children will forever be engraved in U.S. history.